Welcome once again. So, this will be your schedule. We'll have a quick introduction with a bit of house rules. And once the session is done, we'll have a Q&A session where you can directly chat with Herb. And we hope it will be as interactive as possible. And you can use the Microsoft Q&A functionality that we will put it in the chat message, and then we'll have a quick conclusion and closing remarks. So the house rules. So if you're driving, kindly stop at a safe place for the duration of the tech talk. Hope you're aware of your surroundings and are in a safe place. The session will be from anywhere from 1 hour to 1.5 hours, and 30 minutes of live Q&A interaction, and all questions will be moderated. Kindly ask relevant and focused questions specific to the topic of today, and we hope you make the best out of it, because this is a very interactive session. And if your question is selected, kindly have a direct conversation with the speaker. The host will unmute you and you may speak directly with the expert. And do not enter any questions into the chat message. All right. Welcome again, Herb. Really glad to have you here and you joining with us today. We are looking forward to your insightful session. Very briefly about Herb. Herb has around 40 years of experience in various industry sectors, predominantly automation, information exchange, system integration. He is also an IEEE fellow. And Mr. Herb has been the leading voice in shaping the cybersecurity landscape for critical infrastructure since the early 2000s. He also serves in the US Technical Advisory Group, which led to IEC Technical Committee 57, Working Group 15, which is basically responsible for the cybersecurity across the IEC TC57 standard suite. And as also a long-standing editor of IEC 61850, Mr. Herb has played a pivotal role in developing the core standards that we know as today, and also addressing various security extensions, including those regarding the secure communication protocols and the system level defense in depth architecture. He is currently the co-chair of ISA IEC 62443 Working Group 14, which is focusing on the standardization of defense in depth profiles for the energy OT sector. Additionally, Mr. Herb also contributes to the IEEE Power Systems, Communication and Cybersecurity Committee, and is also very actively engaged with the DNP3 Security Task Force. Throughout his career, he has conducted numerous cyber risk and cost assessments worldwide, helping and guiding the utilities and vendors in strengthening their cybersecurity posture. As Vice President of Testing for the UCAIug International Users Group, he has led IC 61850 interoperability testing events from 2011 till 2017, which are the very critical milestones in promoting vendor-neutral, standards-based integration. His previous roles include engineering leadership positions at Westinghouse, Pneumologic, and Cisco, where he oversaw projects and products related to IEC 61850 and CIM integration. With a legacy spanning from early adoption of 61850 in the 1980s to the active cybersecurity leadership since 1990s, Mr. Herb continues to shape the secure and digital transformation of the electric power sector. Over to you, Herb. Welcome again once. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. And I'm just going to let you see that I'm not an artificial intelligence talking to you right now. And then I'm going to turn my camera off because my image isn't really relevant. So let's get started. And let's see. Can you guys all see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me just get back to the right thing on my other display. There we go. All right. So thank you for that introduction. It makes me sound like an expert. But in my definition, an expert is someone who thinks they have nothing else left to learn. And as we know in cybersecurity, that's never the case. We are in an evolving landscape. And, OT cybersecurity is not for the faint of heart. So just a brief story of how this seminar came to be. There was a post about R-GOOSE where I had to make some technical corrections, and that got me invited to do this presentation. So this presentation is really, I'm not sure how many of you are really familiar with GOOSE or R-GOOSE. We're going to talk about its history, some design principles, key and policy delivery, the application and T profiles. There were some questions about performance, interoperability, and then we're going to discuss some future work that's coming down the road. So the generic object-oriented substation event, GOOSE, started in 1998 by 13 of us as part of the EPRI utility communication architecture. The use case that GOOSE ended up being designed for was a large substation with 100 IEDs, each of which needed to communicate with 10 to 30 other devices within 4 milliseconds because of an event, a tornado basically coming through the substation. I cannot take total I was not the only designer of GOOSE or the decision to use Ethernet multicast. I worked with George Schimmel from Tamarack in a collaborative fashion, and we came to the conclusion that Ethernet multicast was the way to go. Now, in 1998, in 1998, the use of Ethernet for anything real time was not accepted, okay? And I constantly get asked, why didn't you just use TCP for this? So the two main reasons that TCP or any other retransmitting transport layer can't be used for GOOSE is protection needs the current state of information and not the retransmitted information that could occur through transports of unacknowledged information. That can lead to misoperation. So while I was at Cisco, we determined that the math for Ethernet showed it was more deterministic than token passing field buses. And that was particularly due to when you drop a token, how rapidly can you reestablish the passing? And so the field buses back in the day were Modbus Plus, Allen Bradley Data Highway Plus, Profibus, and the industry did not believe the math, specifically IEEE and IEC. So we needed to prove it. So back in the early 2000s, Cisco staged a system with 20 Intel 286 DOS computers. And many of you probably don't even know what that is, okay? And originally the industry wanted us to stage all 100 nodes, but that would have been prohibitively expensive. So we got an agreement from the industry that Cisco would do 20 nodes, Fraunhofer would simulate the network, and if the results from the Cisco lab aligned, but they would be offset with the simulations, then we know that the simulations are correct. And during all of this, we found problems in 3Com network cards that weren't behaving the way Ethernet was supposed to behave. And when you do base research, when you find something that is not expected or questionable behavior, you need to resolve it or the industry's not going to accept the results. So we had a contact, Bob Metcalf, who is theoretically the inventor of Ethernet, who was the owner of 3Com, and he agreed the 3Com cards had an issue, got 3Com to correct the issue, and then we were able to proceed with our testing. I want to thank Cisco because they supplied the first Ethernet, Catalyst Ethernet switch at the time, which was a $50,000 piece of equipment. Karl-Heinz Schwartz helped with the simulation at the Fraunhofer Institute, and Bill Blair, who had the gumption to actually fund this activity to prove it. So in the end, the test results confirmed the simulation results, and the industry had to believe at that point in time. Some of the industrial field bus suppliers reran the test against their technology, and they confirmed it as well. And that was the foundation of industrial Ethernet adoption. So the base research for GOOSE, if you're in the industrial world using Ethernet for automation, this is the base research that enabled that. And I'm proud to have been a part of that. Okay, so what are we doing in protection? On the left-hand side here is the hardware representation, where you have a coil and an output relay contacts that go into a trip input on an IED. And, there's some logic here, and then an output. When we were doing the performance for the use case, they said 4 milliseconds. But if you look at the pickup time of these contacts versus the debounce time of the trip input, hardware performance is constrained by physics, and it's typically 8 to 20 milliseconds. So the question is, could Ethernet multicast beat the 8 to 20 milliseconds and be in the 4 to 3 millisecond range? Now, that means from the time the monitoring relay or this device decides that it needs to send a message to the time this device receives the message. And we all know Ethernet is very fast, but that's what the 4 or 3 milliseconds means, just so you know. Okay, GOOSE is state information and not commands. So that's something a lot of people have to get their head around. Each subscriber receives the information, processes that information in its logic, and then takes action. And this allows for a single GOOSE to be sent to multiple recipients and have something like breaker fail reclose implemented with just a single state being conveyed. I always like to say a good standard is one in which everyone is equally dissatisfied, and GOOSE was a good standard by that definition. Okay, so our GOOSE history. There was this thing called the North American Synchrophaser Project, and it's called IEEE. It evolved into IEEE C37-118. There are two parts. One is the measurement standard, and one is the application protocol for delivery of synchrophasers. It was split because 61850 already had a streaming protocol, but C37-118.2 had no transport standardization and no cybersecurity. So in 2010, the work on IEC 61850 90-5 began, and it was published in 2012. And it still utilizes the design principles of the Layer 2 GOOSE, but I just want to say I'm not the only one responsible for this, so you can't blame me, but I'm the leader of it. So when you think about the core 61850 core standards, there are 325 registered members on the committee from 35 different countries. Working Group 15 has 160 registered members from 26 countries, and it includes the leaders in PKI X509, ITU, and IETF. And that combination of active participants led to the formation of 90-5 in 2012. When we needed high availability because protection is a critical function, needed to support multicast security. It needed real-time performance, and we needed to prevent flat layer 2 networks across multiple geographic areas. If you're in OT or IT, you know that this flat layer 2 network is very difficult to maintain and diagnose. So you can see in red 90-5, never use it in your RFPs any longer, okay, or RFQs. What was in the original 90-5 were what you see over here. And at that time, it was the policy in Working Group 10 to gather all the technical requirements in a technical report so they could be consistent across the document, and then split them into international standards where they belong. So we're already publishing and removing all of the technical specifications from all the 90-5, from the 90-5 document. And all that's going to be left is use cases and requirements. So where did the rest of it go? Okay. So I'm not going to go into detail, but this is where things split up. Now, I also want to show you a little glimpse of, see if this will come up. Nah, it's not coming up. Maybe. Hang on. Nope. We'll just move on. So in my mind, 61850 90-5, you should never mention it again. Okay. Oh, there it came up. Okay. So one of the things we got in a discussion about on LinkedIn was that R-GOOSE doesn't use VLANs. It does use VLANs, and we'll get into how it can do that. But I just want you to take a look at the configuration parameters. And there's a real weird one. And so not only do you have VLAN priority, but you also have IP class of traffic, which is specified to be carried in DSCP. But if you look at this one requirement, this allows spoofing of IP source addresses. And we'll get into why that is, but R-GOOSE, in order to prevent multicast storms, uses source-specific multicasting in IGMP v3. So if you take a look at a subscriber who's subscribing IGMP v3, it needs to have a consistent IP address, source address, for that subscription. So just to show you, this has been fairly well thought out. So next. So we're using group domain of interpretation for the management plane here, and GOOSE and R-GOOSE for the operational plane, which is the actual control. So the ports that get used for UDP are 848 and port 102. So if you're setting up firewalls, that's important. So the management plane is designed for availability, integrity, confidentiality. The threat vectors we all know that need to be encountered, be countered are listed above. And we also have developed state machines in 62351-6 to prevent replay. And those apply to layer 2 GOOSE, R-GOOSE sample values as well. 61850 adds some additional requirements for testability, which typically isn't considered in most OT cyber protocols. And by that I mean, if you're going to test a system without designing in testability, you typically have to decommission security to do that testing. And people forget to turn it back on. So, and it's the ability to protect information based upon the data that's being conveyed, not necessarily the source of the information, which makes it very different than a lot of other things. So if you look up RFC 8052, my name is on it. And the reason we did this is when you use IKE V1 or V2 and GDOI, it was just set up to handle information based upon IP addresses. Being a standards organization, we wanted something more extensible. And so 8052 allows the extension of those standards to be applied for multicast or unicast in other domains, okay? And it also defines the ability to deliver multiple policies and keys. So this is part of the design in of resiliency and availability to keep security working, even if the management entity is down. So it's different than a lot of other stuff. So the key distribution center needs to provide enough information to ride through outages of the KDC. And of course, there can be redundancy. Resynchronization mechanisms need to be provided, and you need to be able to continue cyber even when the KDC is offline. So the fact you have a failure to deliver policies and keys in a timely manner doesn't necessarily cause cyber security to go away. So this is the basic exchange mechanism between what's called a group member and the KDC. The pull is mandatory, the push is optional. But basically, on power up, the group member does a pull for the triplet of information it wants to get keys and policies for. And when that gets completed, if it's authenticated, it gets the keys and policies. One of the things that is exchanged here is the key encryption key, which is used in the push. So if a group member receives a push that it can't decrypt, its fallback is to go and do a pull again. So even if things get out of sync, there's a very well-established mechanism for group members to resync with the KDC. The other thing that's nice about push is it can be done via unicast or multicast IP addresses. Though right now, the multicast isn't implemented. So what gets delivered? 2 traffic encryption keys, text, and the policies to use for the operational real-time playing, 1 key encryption key. The amount of cyber policy key coverage is determined by the key rotation time, and typically it gets aligned with certificate revocation periods. So 1 delivery by the KDC can provide 48 hours worth of cyber protection and policies. So the way a group pull works is it uses Diffie-Hellman, and this is just a simplified representation of what happens. But basically, ephemeral keys get generated. And once the ephemeral keys get generated, identity certificates, X509 certificates, get exchanged, and both ends check for validity of the certificate. So there's mutual authentication going on for the group members versus the KDC. If it's not authenticated, it will not get any keys or policies. So with that, the ephemeral key is then used to encrypt and protect a request from the group member for the keys and policies. And then eventually the keys and the policies get delivered. The push is much more simple. And you see this thing for KDA, key delivery assurance. So let's talk about that. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So the way you bring in a transient cyber asset like a test set to test the operational plane is you give it a certificate that can be validated by the KDC. It does a pull for the information it wants, and it gets that information, and it can participate in the system. And in 61850 for test sets, it can do simulation of secure GOOSE sample values, routable GOOSE, and that type of stuff. Again, without decommissioning security. This also allows for cyber monitoring for intrusions, even in intrusion prevention systems and IDSs, even if the information is encrypted. because they've got the keys. And this is vastly different than the way TLS operates. So here's the policies that currently exist. There's a remaining lifetime policy so that you know there's an activation delay, and then the key delivery assurance, which is a policy that requires the KDC to track how many group members have acknowledged the new keys and policies, and then to tell the publisher if it's okay to rotate the keys. So if you set KDA to 100% and one of your devices is in maintenance mode or offline, the publisher's not going to rotate the keys for that. So I strongly recommend policies in the 70 to 80% range there, but it's a utility and a cyber policy issue. Okay. There is also an option to use no security, but in the standard, that's reserved for non-production systems. Okay, we discussed this. The side effect of KDA is if the KDC is offline, the publisher continues to use the last can policy. There's more resiliency because of the activation delay. We know things can get out of sync. So when you deliver the two policies, the two sets of policies, I should say, the activation delay allows for each key and policy set to overlap for a given period of time. Again, we're doing everything we can for availability and resiliency. Configuration of all of this is really just based upon what's called the system configuration language file, and all the information you need to know which groups for which publishers are in something called a system configuration description file, which is an XML file. Okay. And based upon this, it is possible to configure system-wide security in about 5 minutes. So we've not only designed it to be resilient and available, but to take away one of the major burdens that most utilities and OT people see, and that's the commissioning and installation and management of security. We got lucky that SCL had this information in it, but it does. So if you properly implement a KDC, this is all the information you need. Okay, so let's talk about the operational plane, because this is where protection actually occurs. So we've added security to layer 2 GOOSE and obviously for routable GOOSE. The policy that gets delivered by the KDC over the management plane tells you if encryption is going to be used. Okay. And for layer 2 GOOSE, it tells you if security's even in place, right? Encryption and MAC require cyber keys. MACs in this diagram are signatures. Okay. So the layer 2 security was designed to allow migration of layer 2 GOOSE systems. So because it's appended to the end of the layer 2 GOOSE APDU, but does not change the layer 2 GOOSE APDU, it looks like Ethernet padding. So this allows existing systems to bring in layer 2 security and have it ignored by non-secure layer 2 subscribers. And then you can update those subscribers individually, but you don't require a bulk update of your system to just because you're bringing in layer 2 GOOSE or sample value security. So one of the things that's in OT's best interest is to always provide a migration strategy so that you don't have to do a bulk replacement. And we really do try and design that in up front. And we've been successful with GOOSE and R-GOOSE and RSV and sample values here. So this is kind of what the stack looks like from an OSI 7-layer stack perspective. Now, one of the other things that was in the LinkedIn post, well, we all know that IP typically comes out of devices as untagged. And so when they get to the first hop switch, it's untagged and you tag it with a VLAN and a priority. Well, that's the way most OS IP stacks work. But for R-GOOSE and R sample values, you can't use OS stacks reliably. And you saw up front the, and I got a misspelling here, sorry, that you can specify the VLAN and priority. You can specify the DSCP in the IP header. So there's this requirement that you have to be able to do it, which is in conflict with the way Windows, Linux stacks are constructed. So inevitably, this leads implementers to develop their own UDP IP stacks. And having done this, it's not that difficult. And because you also require the ability to spoof the source IP address to minimize the configuration of subscribers, that's another reason to do it. Now, way back when, if I were to ask you the question of why are most UDP IP packets not delivered to an application, most people would say it's the network. And that is a false statement. When I was at Cisco, there was a system going in where they were having problems. And so we did, a deep dive into it. And we found that it was the UDP buffer handling in most of the major operating systems that have a predefined static buffer allocated. And unlike TCP, that buffer does not grow under load. So if you reach that buffer's limit, incoming packets get discarded. And until you do a deep dive into this type of stuff, most people wouldn't even realize that. Now, you can configure a larger buffer, but there are downsides to doing that, obviously, performance being one of them. So most of the R-GOOSE, RSV vendors actually do all the buffer handling in their stacks without the use of the OS. Performance considerations. That was another thing from the LinkedIn post. So there are additional octets on the wire, And obviously, when you do encryption and confidentiality, there are CPU and performance constraint issues there. So I want to address both of those. Okay, so if you compare layer 2 GOOSE to R-GOOSE, as an estimate, there are about 85 octets added to the packet. If you're at 100 megabits, that adds 6.8 microseconds of transmission latency. Still well within 3 milliseconds. So it's not a real issue. And now in most places we have gig Ethernet going into substations. So it's even less of a concern. And in industrial systems, you've definitely got gig. So I would personally maintain this is not anything to be worried about from performance perspective. Obviously, when you go over a wide area network, you don't have this speed. But if you're running a VPN, right, with IPsec encapsulation, you're already adding bytes or octets. Okay, and we're going to talk about a system that can run this stuff over a T1 a little later on. Okay, so in IEEE, there's a group I participate in called S15. We're trying to come up with a guide that tells people how to really deploy secure GOOSE and R-GOOSE and sample values. And sometimes I don't know when to keep my mouth shut, but we were discussing the impact of performance. And I said, well, if you use AES GMAC or GCM, the impact, and you have crypto acceleration, the impact is minimal. And they said, prove it. So I developed some code and set off proving it. So if you look at, and these are microseconds here, okay, you can see AES GMAC and GMC are much better than AES CBC 128, okay, or HMAC SHA 128, right? It's almost, 3 times less or 3 times more performant, okay? And then we started to look at, encryption and decryption, and it still held true. Now, not all devices in the field have crypto acceleration, but even the new ARM chips have it these days. So crypto acceleration is coming, and that's something important to think about, okay? But even without crypto acceleration, right, you're still going to be able to meet the 3 milliseconds unless you're doing a lot of encryption and decryption. So we actually ran these tests. And you can see that a Broadcom 1.8 gigahertz for HMAC, GMAX with no crypto acceleration is 17 microseconds. So if you're doing a lot of it, there's some concern. If you're doing it 1Z, 2Z, 16s, probably not a lot of concern. And in the references slide at the bottom, at the end of this presentation, I've actually included a link where you can download the test executable. It's .NET Core, so you can run it even theoretically on your iPhone if you want to. Interoperability and side effects. We had 5 to 6 vendors that demonstrated interoperability of secure R-GOOSE, but we encountered a network design issue with the 1500 octet MTU. It's not sufficient for having networks that are encapsulating VLANs, PRP, or HSR. And let me tell you, this was a bugger to debug and to find the root cause. And then you find out that 62439 already acknowledged this. And what most people don't realize is when you're using VLANs, it's possible to encapsulate one VLAN in other VLANs and so forth. And you can rapidly exceed the 1522 octets. Okay, so 62439 references IEEE 8802-3/2021, which recommends an envelope frame size of 2000 octets to be configured in switches. I would suspect that this is a surprise to most of you on this call here. But this is what we look for in interops. So now, unmanaged switches may not be able to adjust to a large enough size. So you have to take that into consideration when you're designing your network and choose equipment as well. So the previous parts of this presentation have been fact. I'm now getting into the part of the presentation where I may be expressing personal opinions. And so I want to be explicitly clear as to what's a personal opinion and what's a fact. So I've been asked, will R-GOOSE become prevalent in substations, basically replacing layer 2 GOOSE? And my answer is probably yes. And there's several use cases for this, but right now the ecosystem doesn't allow that to happen. And the use cases are, if you're publishing an R-GOOSE to go out over a wide area network, and that information needs to be consumed in the substation on the local area network, why wouldn't you just consume it on the local area network? And eventually, IP management of switches is going to become easier with IP routability, even if you don't allow it to go out of substations or out of manufacturing facilities. And that's my personal opinion. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, there's this SCE CRAS system. We're going to go into a little bit more of a deep dive. Germany's completing a FAT, going into SAT for a system that's going to the field, and it's got 4 more systems in the queue. I've heard rumors that there's one going in the Netherlands. We know something's going on in Japan, but we don't know what, okay? And in the interim, you may not be familiar with the National Electronic Manufacturers Association in the US, but we've been developing specifications of how to use this technology for distributed automation on distribution networks, fault location, isolation and restoration, DER transfer trip, and others. Okay, now, why would you use R-GOOSE as opposed to layer 2 GOOSE? For those, the reason is if you're running over LTE, there's no standardized way to run layer 2 GOOSE over LTE. But since R-GOOSE is IP, there is a standard way to send it over LTE. So let's just leave it at that. But the US is developing standards for this. So let's talk about SCE. It is the most extensive R-GOOSE system that I know of. And I was the original architect of this when I was at Cisco. Its availability requirements are 5 nines, which means it can only have about 6 minutes of non-availability per year. Now think about designing a system for that, okay? Now, some of the substations are 1,000 miles away, communication distance, from the control centers that are centralizing this protection. So here were the performance requirements laid out, okay? And it said that the target cycle time in the controller has to be under 50 milliseconds, okay? Of that budget, 38 milliseconds was reserved for communication latency. The CRAS processing time can be no more than 4 milliseconds. So the measurement of the inbound to outbound latency addressing this 4 millisecond processor time in the current system is less than 1 millisecond, with some variance, obviously. So R-GOOSE is definitely performant enough, and we actually had to slow it down because it was operating faster than the local protection in the substation. So the 1 millisecond is slowed down intentionally. So what does this system look like to achieve 5 nines? Well, sorry, this is what another centralized scheme looked like, which was hardware-based. And this is the transition to software-based. This is an entire control center using blade technology. And SCE doesn't like blades any longer, so it's not going to look like this on the refresh, but just look at all the cabinets you've removed, okay? And think about how easy it is to manage this as opposed to this. Okay, so this is the deployed solution, okay? The WAN is MPLS, SONET, and microwave. The original uses T1 microwaves as backup communication. There was one RAS centralized that used layer 2 GOOSE with L2TP and VPNs. And that's where we ran into the flat layer 2 network. And that's when they transitioned to routable GOOSE. So this system's been in place and in production since 2014 and R-GOOSE since 2019. And there are about 2,000 GOOSE publications going bi-directionally in this system. Okay. So if you think about these controllers up here, they are huge GOOSE processors. Okay, they receive the 2000 GOOSE messages, they process them, they run the protection algorithms, and then they output results. To meet this the 5 nines, we decided to do a dual triple redundant active-active system. So you see a pair of controllers and 3 pairs in each control center. Now, when you design such a system, right, where do you put the voting so that the IEDs out in the field actually know what action to take? You can't have 2 because if they disagree, there's no way to resolve which one to go with, and you may misoperate. So that's why there are 3 pairs here. And the voting was placed in the IED itself. Okay, it's a unique architecture by that perspective, because most OT people would say, put the voting up here, but that creates a single point of failure. Okay, now, another thing that detracts from 5 nines is if one of these devices is down. So there was this concept of cross-pollination. And this is something you can only do with multicast, where the information from the B system is sent over to the A system and consumed. And the A system information comes over to the B system. So even if you take a device in the field down that's critical for the processing of the A system, the A system gets supplemented by the B system information and is still 100% available. Now, I'd like to say we need a new term for this, but that's the system. And so there are opportunities when you go routable multicast and R-GOOSE to do things if you think outside the box. So we also found in other systems that not all firewalls play nice with IGMP. And to get multicast to go over the wide area network and not create storms and to create paths through a routed network, you need to have IGMP. Therefore, if you're going to deploy this system, your architecture and selection of firewalls and routers needs to be closely evaluated and tested. We know of one major firewall vendor that is just almost impossible to get IGMP through. So I'm not going to mention that vendor, but it's out there. Now, when you go to digital testing and the speed of GOOSE, right, there are opportunities that allow testing of all permutations and combinations of logic to be done. And that helps you find gaps in your logic, because most of the protection people only test what they expect to happen. But you can test all permutations and combinations of states rapidly in this digital age. So I would suggest that when you work with people with this technology, you ask them, are you testing all permutations and combinations? Okay. Okay, so here's our current ecosystem. There are 2 relay vendors, one from Europe and Canada, which is GE, and one from Japan and India, which is Toshiba. Nozomi has an intrusion detection system that can participate as a secure monitor. Doble has introduced test equipment that can also participate. Stacks are available from JP Embedded, which is in Poland, and Cisco and Triangle Microworks that are in the United States. The Unified Analytic Platform is what those RAS controllers were, and that's from Cisco, and that's what's used in SCE. Several vendors have diagnostic equipment and simulation software, and one vendor actually provides a KDC at this point in time. So we know at least 2 other protection relay vendors are intending to bring this to the 2026 Interop, which hopefully will be held somewhere in Europe in the October timeframe. We have one turbine controller vendor whose name has asked not to be disclosed, that is almost close to releasing product. One of the things that's in 62351-9 is how to use GDOI to manage PTP security. And there's more coming. So the ecosystem is growing. So if you want to do an IOP of this technology, it may be possible to do it over the internet. If you want to attend the face-to-face interop, it's more than just R-GOOSE. You can read what it is related. We're having a kickoff meeting this Friday. Here's the network we staged in 2024 that we staged in 3 to 4 days. So we actually had 3 substations and a control center with routers, switches, PRP, approximately 150 devices. And if you're a real geek, this is what our network looked like. So if you really want to get your hands on, get dirty, be with the preeminent suppliers of this stuff, find the problems in a hosted environment. I like to say people come to the interops to fail, not to succeed, because it's through failure we improve the standards and implementations. So interops are very important, especially in cybersecurity. So future work. Let's talk about post-quantum. Okay, you've seen in routable GOOSE, we use Diffie-Hellman, right? And there's no real new NIST approved Diffie-Hellman replacement at this point in time. And I'm not sure all of the protocols we use in OT are going to be able to be transitioned to PQ keys and algorithms in the future and by 2035. We've done an analysis in Working Group 15, and there is just a lot of work to do. So imagine transitioning TLS, HTTPS, right? And when 2035 comes around, are you going to do away with your IPsec VPN times? Probably not. Okay. So we can strive for it, but in terms of R-GOOSE and GDOI, We're on IKEv1. IKEv2 would have been where you would have put post-quantum resistant technology, but the IETF has said IKEv2 has its features closed. So we have no idea what is going to replace it. And within Working Group 15, we might have to develop our own. Now, supporting existing systems, not needing bulk updates or upgrades, is something that Working Group 15 is very concerned about. So we have to go a little bit further. Now, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about the 2030 regulation in Australia and New Zealand that mandates the direct deprecation of SHA-256. Now, my personal opinion is this is a statement that is just politicians getting involved where they shouldn't be involved. Now, I have not read the entire legislation, but people interpret this as you have to do away with SHA-256. Right? Now, I'm going to show you something. Okay. We are still using SHA-1. So this is RFC 5280, which defines what a certificate revocation list and its contents look like. And in this standard, it says it's SHA-1. And when I do security scans on the software that I create that does this stuff, it always tells me you're using an insecure deprecated patch. But this is in the standard. It's been in the standard forever. If you change this, your ability to revoke certificates is probably going to go away. And I do not believe that is what the intent of the legislation was. Because I think if we all are honest about it, when you're using a hash to come up with a shorthand for contents in a file, it really doesn't matter what that shorthand is or the cybersecurity aspects of it. Okay? So, with that, I want to go back to post-quantum because post-quantum actually interacts with hashing, right? Because we all come up with signatures. Is a SHA-256 hash of a signed post-quantum envelope secure? And I don't know. We're going to have to look at it, right? So I'm not sure. Now, luckily, most people have code that's OpenSSL that has SHA-384 in it. So that's not too much of a lift, except where the standards say you have to use a different SHA. Okay? So there's standards out there that allow crypto agility, and then there's some standards that have not put that in. So I don't know. I am also not aware personally of how much you're allowed to truncate a post-quantum signature or hash, because we're just getting involved. Now, the other thing that is problematic for me personally is these post-quantum resistant suites got released, and then at least one or two of them, they decided to tweak some things to make them more resistant. Now, for us in the OT industry, we need stability. So how long do we wait for this to stabilize and start gaining experimental knowledge of how to apply this stuff? The other problem is in our OT space, at least in the electric utility industry, we still have serial protocols. Imagine having to convey a 1,000-octet signature down a 9600 baud serial link. That's just going to clog the link and prevent operations. How we're going to get around that? We got to research it. But that's why I brought up truncation. Okay? Let's see here. So here's the references slide. Let me go back to post-quantum. So not only do we need the keys and the algorithms, but we also need the infrastructure to support it, like LDAP, CAs, SCEP and OCSP, EST. We got to get TLS straightened out. Okay? It's just going to be a heavy lift for those of us who are concerned about implementations. Okay, so here's some references. I was going to do a post-quantum performance tester, but the code got changed and I just don't have time due to other projects to actually generate an equivalent of this. And there you go. So I think we're in the questions stage now. Hopefully it was useful for you guys.
You are unmuted, Luca. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's a very just simple question from me because I work for the DSO in Italy, and we are experimenting the routable GOOSE on a wide area network because we were used to use the GOOSE messages. We have a long experience about that, and we are thinking to pass to routable GOOSE. And my question was very easy, let me say, and is about the VLAN ID, because we had some problem with the router, because as you know, the join request doesn't use it, but the routable GOOSE use it. So what do you think about that? Or if you think it is a local issue and it must be solved as we did acting on the routable GOOSE. And the second question is related on if you think if on the IEC will be written on the part 8.1 of the 61850 something about the routable GOOSE, because
okay, let me handle
sorry.
that. Let me handle that. 8.1 edition 2.1 has routable GOOSE in it. Okay, so edition 2 amendment 1 has it in it. Okay, and that was Hang on. That was this slide.
So for the moment, I was referring to 90.5, but okay.
Now, I've been told that what gets in the way of the join is the VLAN. Okay. So we may have to tweak some stuff, but I think it's a solvable problem. Okay. So you just have to have the join on the same VLAN as the routable GOOSE is being published on, and address that in the switch leading into your router, because routers don't pass VLANs anyway. So there you go. It's a solvable problem, I believe. Does that help you at all?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yeah, we are starting to test the automation of the network over routable GOOSE and leaving the use of the GOOSE. Of course, we are using the GOOSE, so I think it will be a good use case to discuss in the next future.
Yep, and believe it or not, if you find an issue, right, you've got my contact information, send it to us. Or there is on the references section a link to the UCA RIDMine, and there is a 61850 user feedback task force where you can enter the issue and have people from 61850 and Working Group 15 take a look at that issue and see how to address it. There's also a tissue database for both that's in the references section, and you can enter a technical issue and ask for resolution there. So, next question.
Thank you.
Johan, you are unmuted. Johan, are you there?
Yeah, hi Herb, Johan Malmström, Västermo, Sweden.
How do I know that you're on the call?
Yeah. You suggested avoiding operating systems UDP IP stacks because of the buffer, I understood. Do you know if there are any open source or community supported UDP IP stacks that can be used for development or testing?
So the problem is one of scalability, right? So depending upon how much you want to test, starting off with a UDP IP stack from an OS is okay. And there are ways to manipulate it, right? Because there are settings at the OS level that can increase the size. But the larger you make that, the slower the performance is. So anyway, I would start off with whatever your OS of choice is. Someone's going to create an open source UDP IP stack. There's got to be one out there that interfaces to a PCAP down below, right? So you can grab the Ethernet frames and analyze them. That's basically what you've got to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Herb. Great presentation today.
Thank you.
Anthony, you are next.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Very good presentation. How to implement R-GOOSE between wind farm, substation, and central SCADA system across routable IP network. I've got two questions. That's the first question, and I'll wait for you to give a bit of guidance on this.
What was the question?
How others have implemented R-GOOSE, or how best to implement R-GOOSE between sort of a wind farm substation and the central sort of SCADA system across routed IP networks?
Well, it starts with, is R-GOOSE in your devices, right? So there is going to be a turbine controller coming out that does in wind farms that is from a major manufacturer, and I don't know the specifics, and I don't know if you can upgrade their existing controllers to do it. Okay, so that's all questions in my mind. Now, are you using layer 2 GOOSE there?
Yes.
Okay, and you want to avoid L2TP and VPNs, right?
Correct, yeah.
So if you're willing to have a little performance hit, right, you can pretty easily translate layer 2 GOOSE into R-GOOSE. It's going to take some coding. GE at one point in time actually had software for their relays that actually did that. I don't know what its disposition is now. So, and I think we measured that translation was in the 50 to 60 microsecond range back when they had the software. It's not that hard to envision it, right? It's just a configuration issue. And you said you had a...
Yeah, my second question, thank you. My second question is around, can R-GOOSE coexist with GOOSE sample values on the same SCADA VLAN, or this needs to be isolated?
Yes, it doesn't have to be isolated. It's all a system design issue, right?
All right. Okay.
But if you're going to do that, right? You may want to turn off IGMP snooping in your switches.
Right. Okay, sure. I see the reason behind that. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
So we have a last person, Jean. Can you unmute and ask your query? Jean Leon? So his question is that most of the delay for trip or control actions using GOOSE is not delay on the wire or Ethernet network. Main delay happen processing into publisher and subscriber. What is the effect on the total action time because processing of the encryption messages?
That's what we were trying to get at in this. Hang on. So that's what this is showing. So if you have...
You're sharing your screen?
No, I'm sorry. Sorry, I took it away. There you go. So that's what this slide was intending to... Sorry, guys. To show. You're in the in the 30 microsecond range. 30 to 50 microsecond, depending upon your CPUs. Not bad. 1/10 of a millisecond, encrypt, decrypt. Does that answer the question? Did anybody hear me?
Yeah, we hear, but I don't see that Jan is here. So thank you so much for your valuable insight, Herb, and thanks for and giving this opportunity to host you for this a very valuable topic, which many people are not able to digest sometimes because people talk about the substation automation, they talk about the GOOSE, but what are the securities we can have in the GOOSE and how that R-GOOSE can be a game changer for this. So that was a very insightful session.
I just want to say that because of the turbine manufacturer, it's actually going to be used in generation stations as well.
So that would be the very, very great thing, because if, let's say, an entire power plant, and if it can be used, so it can solve a lot of signaling issues.
Yes. The other thing is, 62443 and some of the European edicts are requiring zones and conduits to be properly modeled for defense in depth. And mutual authentication and zero trust architectures are coming to the forefront there. And R-GOOSE facilitates zero trust architectures. So I just want to, so we're all going to be faced with 62443 requirements. Just keep that mutual authentication is almost going to be mandatory there.
The only challenge, Hub, what I see, because the let's say the competence and the skill set building of the OEM for whom that we are asking them to implement. Because if you ask something from the OEMs, it is very difficult. Even they are still not able to configure the GOOSE these days. So the point is that the more the complexity is getting added, that would be a little challenging. But let's say that people like you and other, they should come forward. We should train the people. We should make the competence so that we can achieve the security.
So I don't know which OEMs you're talking about. Okay.
So I cannot name those OEMs.
Yeah, I would not name them on this call. But if you take a look at the major suppliers, okay, and I will name them. In the US, it's Schweitzer and GE. In Europe, it's Hitachi, ABB, Siemens, and Schneider. All of those IEDs can configure properly. Okay. Now, some of the other OEMs probably don't like the substation configuration language and that engineering process that comes along with 61850. But that's where things get simplified, is if you can do that, you have a single source of truth of your information exchanges. So I don't know if people are still trying to do bottom-up engineering of their network as opposed to top-down. Now, one of the things we demonstrated at the last Interop was automatic configuration of the Ethernet network. In other words, the switches based upon the SCL file. Now think about that for time savings and errors. So we have to convince people to engineer their systems top down as opposed to bottom up. And I think if we do that with the capabilities in SCL and the tools, and I will admit that the tooling to do this configuration is often more expensive to create than to put the protocol in the device. Okay. And if you have a locked-in vendor, right, you know, what's their motivation to do it? I don't know. Approved vendors are a tricky thing, and I've got my own personal opinions there.
No. I understand this, Herb, and this is a, let's say, very, very, very interesting topic that we can have some discussion on this in coming future, and then we can just try to find out how that we can just address those things in the different regions of the world. So we need to hard stop her. Thank you so much. Okay, and looking forward to have many more sessions with you on the power grid related things or 650 related, let's say, aspects where that you have contributed a lot for the cybersecurity side. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
You're very welcome, and I hope it was useful.
Yeah, it
Okay.
was